The wind smelled of sage and pine the day I arrived in Big Timber, Montana, carrying only a duffel bag and the last fragments of a life that no longer felt like mine. I'd driven 12 hours straight from Denver, my old city apartment now just an echo in my rearview mirror. The mountains rose like silent guardians around the small town, their snow-dusted peaks catching the early summer light. It felt like standing at the edge of something bigger than me, vast, endless, and unknown. My name is Walker Grady, and for the past year, I've been trying to outrun the hollow feeling that came from losing someone I thought I'd spend forever with. New York had been suffocating, the constant noise and the crowds too loud to hear my own thoughts. Montana, with its wide skies and quiet mornings, seemed like a place where I could finally breathe again. The cabin I rented sat on the edge of town, a weathered structure of cedar and glass with a front porch that looked out over the hills. I'd chosen it for its solitude, hoping the silence would help me sort through the mess of my life. Inside, the place smelled faintly of wood smoke and old paper. I set my bag down and ran my hand over the worn oak table, the grooves in the wood warm beneath my palm. I let out a slow breath and told myself I could make this home, at least for a while. I spent the first few days wandering through the town's narrow streets, getting to know the rhythm of the place. Big Timber was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's name. There was a hardware store, a diner that smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls, and a small library that felt like a sanctuary. I liked the way people looked you in the eye here, how they paused to chat on street corners like they had all the time in the world. That was where I first saw him, Reid McAllister. It was at the diner on a cool morning, the sky still holding on to the last shreds of dawn. He was sitting at the counter, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as he cradled a mug of coffee. There was a quiet intensity about him, like the mountains themselves had settled in his chest. His hair was the color of sand, cut short and neat, and his eyes, when they flicked up and met mine, were the deep green of a pine forest after rain. I ordered a coffee and took a seat a few stools down, pretending not to notice the way his gaze lingered on me before dropping back to the steam rising from his cup. The waitress, a middle-aged woman named Louise with a kind smile, leaned over the counter to chat with him. "Got that new foal out at the ranch yet?" she asked. "Came in last night," he replied, his voice low and calm. "Little things got spirit." Louise laughed and gave him a gentle pat on the arm before turning back to the coffee machine. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, curious despite myself. There was something grounded about Reid, like he belonged to this land in a way I never had in New York's concrete canyons. Our eyes met again as he stood to leave, and he gave me a small nod, polite but guarded. I returned it, my pulse quickening just a little. I wasn't here for romance, I reminded myself. I was here to figure out who I was without someone else to lean on. But the way his eyes softened when they met mine stuck with me as I walked back to my cabin. Over the next week, I kept busy. I signed up to volunteer at the community center, spent my evenings reading by the fire, and took long walks in the rolling hills outside of town. Everywhere I went, I saw signs of Reid, posters for the summer rodeo featuring his ranch's name, the McAllister brand burned deep into the rough boards of the arena fence. I couldn't help but wonder about the life he led out there, surrounded by horses and open sky. A few days later, I ran into him again at the grocery store. He was picking up feed for his cattle, loading bags of grain into the bed of his truck with practiced ease. I offered to help, half to be polite and half because I wanted an excuse to talk to him. He hesitated, then gave me a small smile. "Thanks," he said, handing me a bag that weighed more than I expected. "I'm Reid." "Walker," I said, shifting the weight in my arms. "I just moved here, trying to find my bearings." He nodded, his eyes flicking up to meet mine. "Montana can be a good place for that." We finished loading the truck in silence, the afternoon sun warm on our backs. When we were done, he closed the tailgate and turned to me, a faint crease between his brows. "You're staying out at the old Turner place, aren't you?" he asked. I blinked in surprise. "Yeah, how did you know?" "Word travels fast around here," he said with a wry smile. "It's a good spot. Peaceful." "Yeah," I said softly. "That's what I'm looking for." Reid studied me for a moment, like he was weighing what I wasn't saying. Then he gave me a nod and climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life. As he drove away, I found myself standing there longer than I should have, watching the dust settle in his wake. Back at my cabin, I couldn't shake the memory of those quiet moments with him. There was a steadiness to Reid that drew me in, a calm that felt like shelter from the storm I'd been living in. And yet, there was something else in his eyes, a shadow of grief, maybe, or a caution that matched my own. I wondered what had put that look there, what stories he kept locked behind those watchful eyes. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. The sky was a canvas of stars, each one bright and cold and impossibly far away. I thought about Reid and the way he carried himself, the way his voice sounded like a promise. I told myself not to get lost in that feeling, not to mistake curiosity for something more. But as the night deepened and the quiet wrapped around me like a balm, I realized I wanted to see him again. I wanted to know the stories behind those green eyes and what he saw when he looked at me. And though I didn't have the answers yet, I felt something shift in my chest, a flicker of hope, small but insistent. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know if I was ready for it. But in that moment, under the endless Montana sky, I was willing to find out. By the second week, I'd settled into a quiet routine. Mornings began early, the light slipping over the mountains in gold ribbons that lit the valley like a promise. I liked the way the air tasted here, crisp, clean, and just a little wild. My days were spent splitting logs for the woodpile or wandering down dusty trails that cut through the hills. Each evening, I'd watch the sun melt into the horizon, the sky blushing with streaks of orange and lavender. I felt like I was finally learning how to be alone without feeling lonely. But the town had a way of pulling me back into its rhythms. Every few days, I'd stop by the diner for a hot meal and a little conversation. Louise, the waitress, always greeted me like I was an old friend, her easy smile making the place feel like home. And most times, Reid was there too, either hunched over a mug of coffee or talking quietly with one of the ranch hands. One morning, I caught his eye as I walked in. He gave me a nod, and I returned it, sliding onto a stool a few seats down. Louise poured me a cup of coffee, and I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, feeling the chill of the morning fade from my fingers. "You settling in all right, Walker?" she asked, her voice kind. "I think so," I said, still getting used to the quiet. She laughed. "Give it a little time. Montana's got a way of getting under your skin." Reid glanced over at me, his expression thoughtful. "It's a good place to get your head on straight," he said. I studied him for a moment, the way his shoulders relaxed when he was around people he trusted, the way he smiled with just the corners of his mouth. There was a calmness to him, but it felt like a fragile thing, like the surface of a frozen pond just before it cracks. That afternoon, I found myself wandering into the hardware store, looking for a new handle for the old axe I'd found at the cabin. The place smelled of cedar and motor oil, and the owner, a wiry man named Cliff, greeted me with a nod. As I was turning the handle over in my hands, Reid walked in, wearing a battered denim jacket that smelled faintly of hay and horses. He paused when he saw me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hey," he replied. He moved closer, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. "You fixing up that place?" "Trying to," I said. "It's seen better days." He smiled faintly. "If you need a hand, let me know. I'm out that way pretty often." The offer caught me off guard. I hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks. I might take you up on that." He shifted his weight, like he was about to say something else, then just nodded and moved on to the next aisle. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and something else, a quiet thrill that felt almost like possibility. Later that week, I found a note tucked under a small pile of mail on my porch. The handwriting was neat, careful. "Walker, I'm heading out to check the river fence tomorrow. If you're up for some fresh air, meet me at the McAllister Ranch at 8. Reid." I read the note twice, my heart beating faster than it should. I told myself it was just an offer to help, that it didn't mean anything more. But that night, I barely slept, the thought of him filling the dark spaces of my mind. Morning came early, the air sharp and bright. I drove out to the McAllister Ranch just as the sun was breaking over the hills. The place was beautiful in a raw, unpolished way, weathered barns, fields of grass that rippled in the wind like a living thing. Reid was waiting by the fence, his dog, a black and white mutt named Buddy, sitting patiently by his side. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but quiet. "Morning," I replied, my breath clouding in the cold air. We started down the fence line together, the grass brushing against our boots. Buddy ran ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging. Reid showed me how to check the fence posts for damage, how to tighten the wire where it had come loose. His hands were steady, sure. Watching him work was like watching the land itself move. No wasted motion, no hesitation. After a while, we paused on a rise overlooking the river. The water flashed silver in the sun, and the wind carried the scent of cottonwoods and earth. Reid leaned against the fence, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "You're different from most folks who come out here," he said quietly. I shrugged. "I guess I'm still trying to figure out what I'm doing." He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt the weight of that gaze settle in my chest. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't figure it out until you stop trying so hard." We stood there for a moment, the silence between us deep and almost comfortable. Then he pushed away from the fence and started back toward the ranch, Buddy trailing at his heels. I followed, my thoughts a jumble of questions I didn't know how to ask. When we reached the barn, he turned to me. "You want to come by for dinner sometime?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes steady. I hesitated, surprised by the invitation. "Yeah," I said finally. "I'd like that." He nodded once, a small smile playing at his lips. "Tomorrow night, then. Bring your appetite." I watched him disappear into the barn, the door swinging shut behind him. The promise of that dinner, of sitting across from him and sharing something more than just fence posts and quiet mornings, settled in my chest like a spark waiting to catch. Driving back to the cabin, I couldn't stop replaying the way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had softened when he spoke. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something I wasn't sure I was ready for. But as the mountains rose up around me and the sky spread out in a vast, endless blue, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the beginning of something real. Maybe it was just a chance to start again. Either way, I wanted to see where it would lead. The next evening, I found myself driving down the dusty road that led to the McAllister Ranch, my palms slick on the steering wheel. The sun was sinking low, setting the sky ablaze with hues of copper and rose. My heart beat faster with every mile, a mixture of excitement and something like fear. I told myself it was just dinner, but I knew it was more than that. It was a chance to see if the quiet pull I felt toward Reid was something real or just another passing moment. Reid met me at the porch, his dog Buddy sprawled across the steps. He was dressed in a simple flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his hair still damp from a quick wash. He looked at me with that same steady calm that seemed to radiate from him, and for a moment, the knot in my chest loosened. "Glad you came," he said as he held the door open. "Me too," I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and something rich and savory. Stew, I guessed. The walls were lined with old photographs, sepia portraits of men and women with the same green eyes as Reid, all of them standing proudly beside horses or cattle. The kitchen was small but warm, a cast-iron pot simmering on the stove and a loaf of bread cooling on the counter. Reid moved around the kitchen with quiet ease, offering me a seat at the worn wooden table. He ladled the stew into bowls, the rich scent filling the air. We ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against ceramic and the occasional soft whine of Buddy begging for scraps. When the meal was finished, Reid leaned back in his chair and studied me. "So, what brought you out here, really?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But the way he watched me, patient, unhurried, made it easier to let the words come. "I needed to get away," I said. "From the city, from everything. I'd been living in New York for years. It started to feel like the walls were closing in, like I couldn't breathe. He nodded, his eyes soft. I know that feeling. I met his gaze, searching for what he meant. You do. Reid's expression shifted, a shadow crossing his face. Yeah, he said quietly. I lost someone a few years back. After that, the ranch was the only thing that made sense. It's easier to be out here, with the land and the animals. Easier than trying to make sense of what's gone. The air between us seemed to thicken with the weight of those words. I wanted to reach across the table and touch his hand, to let him know I understood. But I held back, unsure if it would be welcome. Instead, I said softly, I'm sorry. That sounds hard. He shrugged, but the movement was tight. It was. Still is some days. We fell into another quiet moment, the kind that felt both heavy and comforting. I realized then that Reid and I were more alike than I'd thought. Two men trying to find their footing in the aftermath of loss. After a while, Reid stood and grabbed 2 beers from the fridge. Come on, he said, tilting his head toward the back door. There's something I want to show you. Outside, the night had settled in, the sky alive with stars. Reid led me to a small corral where a handful of horses stood, their coats shimmering in the faint light. He leaned against the fence, one hand resting on the top rail, the bottle of beer in the other. I come out here most nights, he said. It's quiet. Makes it easier to think. I took a sip of the cold beer, the bitterness sharp on my tongue. It's beautiful, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Reid nodded. They're good company, he said, gesturing to the horses. Better than most people. I laughed softly. I'll take that as a compliment. He turned to me then, his eyes catching the moonlight. You should, he said, his tone gentle but sure. We stood there for a long time, the air crisp and filled with the scent of hay and earth. I felt the pull of him, the way his presence steadied something restless inside me. It was both comforting and disquieting, like standing too close to a fire and feeling both the warmth and the danger. Finally, he set his beer down and pushed away from the fence. You want to help me feed them? He asked. I nodded, and he led me into the small barn, the air inside sweet with the smell of hay. He showed me how to portion out the grain, how to hold my hand steady so the horses wouldn't spook. We worked side by side, our shoulders brushing every now and then, each touch sending a quiet thrill through me. When we were finished, we stood in the doorway of the barn, looking out at the dark fields. I felt a strange peace settle over me, the kind I hadn't felt in a long time. Thanks for dinner, I said. And for this. Reid glanced at me, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Anytime, he said. There was a moment of stillness then, a pause where the only sound was the soft rustle of the wind. My heart beat fast in the quiet, the air between us electric. I wanted to close the distance, to see if the warmth in his eyes matched the warmth I felt in my chest. But I held back, afraid to push too far too fast. I should probably head back, I said finally, though I didn't really want to. Reid's expression shifted, a flicker of something, regret, maybe, crossing his face. But he nodded. All right, he said. Drive safe, okay? I will, I promised. As I walked back to my truck, I felt the weight of his gaze on me, like a tether pulling me back even as I left. The night air was cold, but inside, I felt warm, a quiet glow that lingered long after I'd driven away. Back at the cabin, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangle of what had been said and what hadn't. I knew there was something growing between us, something neither of us was ready to name. But it was there, as real and bright as the stars over Montana, and I knew I'd see him again. The thought made sleep slow to come, but when it finally did, it was filled with dreams of green eyes and quiet nights, and the promise of something that felt like hope. The next morning dawned cold and gray, the sky heavy with low clouds that promised rain. I woke with Reid's voice still echoing in my head, the memory of his smile, and the way his hand had brushed mine as we fed the horses. There was a lightness in me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. But there was a nervous edge to it, too, as if I was teetering on a precipice. I spent the day working around the cabin, splitting more logs for the fire and patching a leak in the roof that had started to show itself in the last storm. But every time I paused, my thoughts drifted back to Reid, how he'd looked at me across that worn wooden table, how his quiet voice seemed to settle the restless parts of me. By late afternoon, the sky finally gave in, and the rain came down in cold sheets, drumming against the tin roof. I stood at the window, watching the droplets chase each other down the glass, and thought about calling Reid. But I hesitated. We were still dancing around something, and I didn't want to rush it. Instead, I settled in with a book, the fire crackling in the hearth. But even the words on the page couldn't hold my attention. My mind kept circling back to that barn, to the smell of hay and horses, to the quiet way Reid had looked at me like I was something he'd been searching for without even knowing it. The next day, the rain had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean. I decided to head into town, a restlessness in me that I couldn't quite name. The diner was busy with a lunch crowd, the air filled with the smell of coffee and grilled cheese sandwiches. Louise waved me over to a seat at the counter, her smile warm as ever. "Walker," she said. "Haven't seen you in a couple of days. Everything okay?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just keeping busy out at the cabin." She poured me a cup of coffee and leaned on the counter. "You know, you're starting to look like you belong here," she said. "Most folks who come through can't wait to get back to the city." I thought about that as I sipped the hot coffee, the words settling into me like a seed taking root. Maybe she was right. Maybe this place was starting to feel like more than just an escape. After lunch, I wandered over to the hardware store to pick up some nails for the roof. As I was paying, I heard the familiar sound of the bell above the door and turned to see Reid walking in, his hat pulled low against the drizzle that had started up again. He spotted me and gave a small smile. "Hey," he said, his voice low and warm. "Hey," I said, feeling that quiet thrill again. He glanced at the counter, then back at me. "Got plans tonight?" I hesitated, my heart beating faster. "No." "Why?" "Thought you might want to come by," he said. "I've been working on a new stretch of fence. Could use the company." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Sure. I'd like that." That evening, I drove back out to the ranch. The sky was dark and low, the rain falling in a steady rhythm that felt almost soothing. Reid was waiting by the barn, his coat buttoned up tight against the chill. He looked at me with a small smile that made the cold seem a little less biting. "Glad you made it," he said. "Me too," I replied, stepping closer. We worked side by side in the fading light, the rhythmic clink of hammer on nail filling the silence between us. It was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something almost meditative about the work, about the way our hands moved in sync. As the last board went up, Reid paused, his breath visible in the cold air. "You're a quick learner," he said. I laughed softly. "I've got a good teacher." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "You're not like most folks who come out here," he said. "You're not just passing through." I swallowed, feeling the weight of his words. "I don't want to be," I said quietly. The air between us seemed to crackle then, the rain pattering softly on the tin roof. Reid reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no rush, no sudden urgency, just the quiet certainty of that touch. When he finally let his hand fall away, he gave me a small smile. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of this cold." Inside the barn, it was warmer, the smell of hay and wood smoke wrapping around us like a blanket. We sat on a bale of hay, our shoulders pressed close in the dim light. Reid talked about the ranch, about how the river flooded in the spring, and how the snow could trap you in for days in the winter. I listened, letting his voice wash over me, each word weaving itself into the quiet longing I felt for him. At some point, he fell silent, his gaze drifting to where our knees brushed together. "I don't know what this is," he said softly, "but I know I want to find out." I met his gaze, my breath catching. "Me too," I said. He reached up then, his fingers brushing my cheek, and I leaned into the touch without thinking. It was a small thing, but it felt like a promise. A promise that maybe, just maybe, we could figure this out together. When I finally left that night, the rain had eased to a gentle drizzle. The road back to the cabin was slick and dark, but I felt steady, like the ground had shifted beneath me in a way that made sense. There was still so much I didn't know, so much I hadn't figured out. But I knew this. I wanted to keep coming back to that barn, to that quiet warmth that grew between us with every shared word and every stolen glance. And as I pulled up to the cabin, the lights glowing warm against the dark, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was a small thing, fragile and new, but it was enough to carry me through the night and into whatever came next.